All right, this is into my marathon of video sessions. I've probably got about another hour to go. So I'm going to get into kind of a deep subject for me, which is my own childhood abuse. So when we were talking about Johnny Depp a few weeks ago, and we were talking about men's rights and things of that nature, I first want to come off and say that I was the victim of child abuse from my mother. So I completely understand where the argument is coming from. It's not something that is pushed off in some hypothetical situation for me personally. Not only was I abused by a woman as a child, but I was abused by a woman who is a hardcore feminist who was taught to hate men and repress male qualities and tried to push those thoughts and ideas on her child in the most abusive and hurtful ways possible. So the first thing that, my mother is one of the most screwed up people that I have ever encountered. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that I know my mother, that my mother, I lived with her, I spent every day with her. And, you become privy to the problems with that. There's also, because I'm a child, you have this idea of what a parent thinks is best, the psychology of, these are the traits that I care about and that I want to pass on to my child. So with my mother, the first thing that happened when I was a kid is that, because you're a child, you ask your mother, where's dad? They were divorced. She was a single mother. And she essentially told me that the reason she was no longer with my dad is that he abused her horribly, and that after years of abuse from being with him, she was pregnant with me, and he held her up by her neck and started pummeling her in the stomach, in her pregnant belly, until luckily my uncle walked in on the situation and thwarted my dad from the situation. So, okay, that makes sense. And then she starts crying and she's the victim, and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. And her whole thing is I want you to be a gentleman. That was her word or her phrasing, because I never want you to hurt a woman. I don't think that that's ever acceptable, and you have to protect women. That needs to be your calling in life, and that's what I had you for. However, there was a lot of little things that she was doing that was subversive, because that on its face isn't so bad by any means. I'm by no means an advocate for hurting women. But the point here is that she would tell me things like she wanted me to be gay so that I never could hurt a woman. Things in my childhood and in my nursery were pink. These sorts of things. She always wanted to get me into ballet. The whole idea of gender neutral types of things. Because when you have a parent that goes to a small child who's 2-3 years old, and they're like, hey, wouldn't you love to be in ballet? The idea of toxic masculinity as an idea that was taught to me, that I needed to repress my maleness, was something that was there to me. But I also remember times when I was very young, and I'm talking 4 or 5 years old, where scalding hot coffee was poured on me, where cigarettes, she was a chain smoker, would be put out on me. And I think where it really got toxic, not that what I'm already describing isn't toxic enough, is my grandfather ended up, my grandparents, but specifically my grandfather started looking after me because I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and there was only one daycare that was around. There was only one. And there was a lot of issues with that daycare that I don't remember. However, I think a lot of them revolved around I started having a lot of peeing myself issues, and I started having a lot of issues with things like I wasn't like I started developing a speech impediment and stuttering when I didn't have that when I wasn't there. I think there was a kid there with a stutter, and she was really worried about that. So she, had me stay with my grandparents. I also think there was an issue with my mother paying for things. Like my mom, was unable to really afford the daycare, and it wasn't very good daycare. And my grandmother basically retired early so that she could take care of me full time. My grandfather also retired, and they basically quit what they were doing to take care of me. Well, again, my mother, as soon as I started spending time over there, was alleging that my grandfather abused her. So, constantly telling me that I shouldn't love him, that I shouldn't trust myself around him. And I even remember thinking at a young age, like, if he's so abusive, why are you sending me over there? But she told me it was to make sure or to check in on my grandmother because my grandfather was so abusive towards her. None of this is true, by the way. I feel like that's the bottom line that I'm going to get to, and I'm going to take the time to tell this story in a convincing manner. But my mother would basically invent abuse not only of herself but others. So I was there, and my grandparents took wonderful care of me until my grandfather was diagnosed with what ended up being terminal cancer. So there were a lot of times that my grandparents were unable to take care of me. Just wholesale, like they were dealing with medical issues and the sickness that my grandfather had. So I started spending more time at home with my mother, and my mother, I think, was also resentful because she needed to work to make money, and she was unable to work the hours that she had to take care of me. So basically the time that we would spend together, I would be told these horror stories of what he used to do to her. So one of the bigger issues here became when I started rejecting it and still wanting to spend time with my grandfather and still be close with him, is she started reenacting them. So I remember one time we were in the attic of the house, and she was telling me the story of like she was asking me something. I remember what it was. We were going through attic things to throw stuff out, I think for a garage sale, and there was an old book that my grandfather had bought me about Marines during World War II, which he happened to be a Marine in World War II. So I was going through the book, and I was like, where did this go? I had been looking for this book for a long time. My mother had stashed it in the attic because, Marines are toxic masculinity, and I wasn't allowed to have access to that type of material. So I remember saying, but I love him and I want it, and her telling me the story of when she was little, him pushing her down a flight of stairs, and she thought she was crippled at the bottom. And I just remember saying something to the effect of, well, he's nice to me, I don't really care. And her saying something to the effect, you will care, and throwing me down the flight of the stairs, because the attic, which is basically just a flat drop, it's not even stairs you're going down, it's just basically a free fall. And I remember being at the bottom and hurt, and her chastising me and mentally abusing and breaking me and getting me to be angry at him for things he had done to her during her childhood. And essentially, I remember being mean and distant to my grandfather the last months of his life, when he had been so amazing to me as a child. And just, this is hard to say, but I remember one of the things that I did to get back at him for what he'd done to my mother was jumping on him. He'd be laying out on the couch because he always wanted to be in the living room to spend time. And one of the things I would do is I would run through the hall. I'm 8, by the way, during this time, and jumped up in the air, and I would kind of do like the leg drop from WWE or whatever, and do that kind of on his stomach. And it really hurt him, and he ended up going to the emergency room, and he ended up dying. And that really, really messed with me, because the reason that it happened is because lies that my mother told me that made me want to defend her. And I remember my grandfather's last words to me being something to the effect of, I'll see you again. And I'm almost positive what he meant is more in a spiritual, like heaven type of sense, because I'm pretty sure he knew at that time. But like, my mother was also crazy, like totally a nutcase, in the sense that like she would watch very far right biblical content and believe it completely. I also think you need to understand that my mother is, legally speaking, mentally retarded. And I don't say that to like, make fun of her or say that as an insult. I mean that in a literal sense. I think her IQ was something close to 70. And mine was probably like 170. And I just like, it's funny because like I think back and I always knew my mother said stupid shit. But like, you're a kid and you want your mother to be awesome. And she would tell me how smart she was and how she was in the special classes too when she was a kid. Special in a different way, but I didn't know that. And I just remember she would tell me things that didn't make sense, and I would go to school and get teased because I didn't know any better. Like, I was really good at learning, but like all of the like life skill things I completely was unaware of because the only tutor I had was my mother. I also think you need to understand that my mother was not a very social person. She didn't do well in social settings because, again, she's cuckoo, and anyone with any sense of what a red flag should be would pick up that my mother is not someone that you want to spend your time with. So one of the things that she would do is like she worked in long-term healthcare, specifically insurance. And so she would work with people who were about to retire or who already were retired for trying to sell them insurance. So you're talking about a lot of, 60 to 80-year-olds. And typically she preferred women. She did better with women. So, basically senile old women. And she would consider them all her friend. And one of the things you have to understand about my mother and her quote-unquote friends is that if they would tell her crazy senile delusions, as old people are keen to do, and my mother would take that as gospel. So I'll give you a perfect example, probably one of the most absurd, is one of her clients, I'm sure, told my mother that soda, we used, I laugh because this is such a cliche of West Virginia, but soda, we used to drink Coke. As it is in the South, everything's a Coke. There's Pepsi, Coke. But these two-liter bottles of Mountain Dew and all sorts of different colas. And somebody told my mother that one of the reasons why they would go flat is because she screwed the lid on too tight. That when you unscrew a soda lid and it fizzes, it goes psh, that's where all of the fizz and the carbonation is released, and that if you don't screw it on tightly, you won't have that fizz, and therefore it will not be, it won't get flat, which of course in reality makes it completely flat. And that's the way that my mother wanted things. So also, I'm 6'3". I know you maybe can't tell from here. Pretty large guy. So bending over is difficult when you're larger. So refrigerators were even smaller back in the 80s and 90s when I grew up. So bending over to get things it's more difficult. So, I kind of remembered where things were with my hand. I could just shove my hand in the fridge and get what I wanted. And one of the things that I would do for soda when I used to drink soda, I absolutely don't think that soda is good for you now, and I don't recommend it, but, I drank it a lot back then. I'd pick it up by the top and it would, come off the thing and go everywhere. And I just remember like trying to call my mother on it and be like, this isn't what you think it is. And like her argument for everything that you would call her out on was whatever the girl that told her, whatever her name was, like, Susan or whatever. Just using Susan as an example, I don't know anybody's name or remember it from my childhood because they're 70 and 80, they're all dead now, I'm sure. But Susan told me that this was true. Susan's my friend. If this isn't true, then Susan lied to me, and Susan wouldn't lie to me because she's my friend. And this is the kind of insanity that I would have to deal with. And then it would get to, and what do you know? You're a child. You're only 10 years old. You haven't been on this earth very long, so therefore, nothing that you say is valid. I have a Bible. I am a Christian. You're a Christian. You say you're a Christian. So if you're a Christian, you believe in the Bible, and it says to honor thy mother and their father. And I'm your mother, and I'm telling you this. And if you don't believe what I'm telling you, you're not honoring me, which means that God hates you. She built the entire idea of Christianity, one around honoring thy father and thy mother, so that anything that she said, no matter how crazy, would be gospel. And the idea that Jesus was there to save women, specifically, she would always quote from the idea that, the woman that's about to be stoned of adultery, that Jesus was there to stop men from beating women, which was in their nature to do, and to make men less manly, to make men just kind of more unical, is that a word? Like eunuchs, like to deprive them of their masculinity so that they were more subdued, and she liked very effeminate men. And that's what she wanted. That's what she wanted for other men. And she thought that you could tell a Christian by how subdued they were, and that everything else was some form of the patriarchy and what have you. So I could go into much longer and more detail about the abuses of a child. Like psychological abuse, physical abuse. I remember it got so bad in my teens where I would beat myself beforehand. Like if I knew she was going to beat me for something, I would beat myself with a belt beforehand. And I was strong enough at the time that I could have won a fight, but I was smart enough to know that if I got into a physical altercation with a woman, that it would not go well for me. Even if I said she abused me, it's not going to go well for me. So what I learned to do is I would beat myself bruised and bloody and dare her to do worse. That's where things got. I remember when I was a little kid, if there was things that I liked, like I remember there was movies that I liked, she would throw them away or sell them. We were always doing garage sales, and she would sell them in a garage sale and then tell me that I had misplaced it and I just needed to look harder. So I remember spending like days and weeks looking for things that weren't in the house anymore. I'm sorry, this is difficult, but so I eventually got fed up with my mother and didn't really want a relationship with her anymore. I tried to, my grandmother raised me a lot from then on, and she's passed, but I had an amazing relationship with her. She was a saint of a woman, and didn't really have much of one with my mother. My mother ended up having a stroke, which made her unable to work, and she moved in with my grandmother in the top floor, and I still wanted nothing to do with my mother. But I was in the military for a number of years, and when I finally got out, I was going to go to college, to a program, and there was a few months lap between when I got out of the military and when my classes started. So I decided what I wanted to do was to move in with my grandmother and spend time with her, because I had been overseas a lot and had not really gotten a chance to spend much time with her. So I wanted to have that time. And my mother was there as well. So my mother actually sat me down and, told me that, she had abused me as a child and that she was sorry for that, but that she had been so abused as a child. And she went in to tell me this story that I was unaware of, that my grandmother had gotten married and pregnant right out of high school and had my uncle. And that her husband went off to World War II, because that's what was going on at the time. And back in the day, they don't do this anymore because it ended horribly during the war, but back in World War II, they used to have recruitment, and they would say that, like, if you enlist as friends or as a town, that your entire town can go into a unit so that your friends are with you in the battlefields. So that happened to my grandmother's small town in West Virginia. So everyone from her class enlisted together and were in the same unit together. And she was friends with, a number of people that were serving with her husband, and they would write back to her to tell her that he was having an affair with French prostitutes. So she thought, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and she had an affair with her boss and ended up having my mother. So her husband gets back from World War II and finds his wife pregnant, not by him. So he commits suicide. And my grandmother is now a single mother, and has to take care of two children, and couldn't really afford daycare. So the only care that my mother could have was, both of my mother and my uncle, was from her deceased husband's parents. So, my mother was raised largely by by my uncle's grandparents, who essentially, according to my mother, and again, my mother lies about a lot of things, so take it with a grain of salt, but according to her, during this time, would lock her in a closet and tell her that she killed their son. Again, my mother had a lot of learning disabilities, which, I didn't even know until she told me. Like, she said stupid things, but there was a part of me that still wanted to love my mother and still wanted that connection. So, until she told me, as soon as she says, oh, duh, I'm stupid for not coming to that conclusion, but I think there was just an emotional block before then. And she's like, I had a lot of stunted issues emotionally in terms of no one wanting me, and I had a lot of learning disabilities, and everyone picked on me. And it is what it is. She had a hard time, and my uncle took care of her. So my grandmother finally met my grandfather, not my biological one, but the one who raised me, and he was unable to have children of his own. He physically could not reproduce. So he took her and her two children and loved her and married her and raised the kids. But you also have to understand he was a World War II Marine, fought on, every major battle. He was in Iwo Jima and Pearl Harbor. And he was very strict. His best understanding of how to raise children was discipline. So, he did things. I feel like there's going to be a generational gap in people who aren't involved or understanding of the military, and what I'm going to say next, but he would inspect their beds and expect them to roll their socks, their underwear, their clothes needed to be uniform. He would do the quarter test on the bed and all these sorts of things because he wanted to raise disciplined children. And my uncle took to it amazingly, and my mother did not. She was so emotionally damaged that she just thought that he was picking on her. And I think that to my grandfather, in his way of thinking, he wasn't going to give up on her, that he wasn't going to stop being strict to, take care of her and fix her, because that was his daughter and he was going to take good care of her. So I talked with my grandmother and I talked with my uncle. Neither one of them know of any abuse. My grandmother flat denies that she was ever abused by my grandfather. Another story that might be in here is that my mother was molested as a child, and she was molested by a family member that was on my grandfather's side. Now, the person in question that did the molestation died before she told anyone. And according to my grandmother, when Paul, which was my grandfather's name, found out about it, he was so mad that she said he would have killed him. Like, if he had known when he was alive, he would have killed him. And I believe that because, that he was very protective of his family. But somehow my mother twisted it to think that Paul was in on it, like that he told the creepy family member to molest his kid, which, I don't know. But she went off to college, and according to my grandmother, came back with all these stories of abuse that no one could cooperate. Nobody. That to understand my grandfather is that he was a strict person and that he expected a lot out of people, but he was always fair, and he was always kind of like, to understand who my grandfather was, you had to know that he was fairly well off, and he loved, he was a hard worker, but he would just take care of people. Like, if he heard people were struggling, he would pay for their groceries at the grocery store. He was the kind of guy who would go around the neighborhood, and I remember very vividly the lady who lived behind us, who was very old, him putting a new roof on for her. He owned a metal shop, and he would just teach kids welding, and he would certify people for free. But because things are free, to understand psychology, people who would come to his shop, which not only did he own a big shop, but he had one in his garage that was basically professional. People would just steal stuff from him. They weren't paying for this class. There was no cost of entry. So a lot of people would steal from him. And if you stole from him, you might as well, you were dead for life. He would never trust you again. You were on his shit list. You were, basically unclean. And that's how things would be in terms of how he saw you. That's how he was. So, he took care of people, but he had his own code. My mother, after her stroke, forgot all the stories about my dad and claimed that me, as a child who was traumatized, made up all of these stories about her telling me about my dad abusing me, abusing her. And I think the other hurtful thing there is that my dad, who has since passed, did reach out to me on several occasions trying to reconcile because my mother cast him out. She basically, I just think of my mother's behavior with me and how erratic she was, and I can't imagine being married to someone like that and accusing abuse and doing all these other things. And then she's like, just get away from me, and I'm not going to charge you, not going to charge you like child support. Like bullet dodged, I'm sure is what he was thinking. And I say that being the kid. I say that being the person who didn't get the money. But my dad went off, but he did. He tried to reach out. He tried to contact me several times, and I was, dealing with the stories that my mother told me, very insulting. How can you live with yourself? Why haven't you killed yourself? How could you do that to a woman? And I just remember my dad kind of taking it, like just being like, day by day, I pray every day, and I hope you do too. Because what are you going to say to a kid like that? Like I was so far enveloped into that victimness. You can't pull a kid out of that. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But so I talked to my uncle, and the story of him saving my mom while she's getting beaten in the stomach never happened. I talked to my grandmother about my grandfather and my dad, and she's like, I have no idea. She's like, I didn't like your dad particularly. It seemed a little swarmy, a little bit too of a smooth talker. My dad was a salesman, so that makes sense. But I was never aware of any abuse, and I know that the day that they got married, my grandfather approached my dad and told him that if he ever laid a hand on her, that he would, that would be it. Another thing that my mother said is that that she held against him was that my uncle had asked my grandfather for money. My grandfather gave out loans all the time. I remember my mother's first house was because my grandfather gave her a loan, so that she had a place. He didn't give her the loan until she'd had me, but he wanted me to have a home, so he gave her the money for a house to put me in a house. And he refused to give my uncle money when he needed it. But I feel like the larger point of the story is that my uncle, after Vietnam, was, by his own admission, during that period of time, a drug addict. And I talked to my uncle before he died, and he's like, oh yeah, if Paul had given me that money, I would have injected it or snorted it, and I would have for sure been dead. And me not getting that loan from him was the best thing that ever happened to me. I tried telling my mother to that because you're trying to make some sort of rational argument to her. And first things first, she said that was still no excuse, that he obviously didn't love the children like they were his, and that they were both unwanted. My uncle absolutely adored my grandfather and never felt that way. But two, that my mother, because of the hero worship of my uncle, because I do believe that my uncle actually did take care of and look after my mother when they were growing up, she had such a hero worship of him that she would take away attributes of him that she thought were bad. So my mother hates toxic masculinity. So she hates the military. I was in the military, my uncle was in the military, my grandfather was in the military. My uncle, who has since passed, died of cancer from Agent Orange, from being in Vietnam. My mother would not admit that when he died. She would not admit that he was ever in the military or that he was ever in Vietnam. She blocked it out of her mind because her excuse was, good people don't join the military. Bill was a good person. He would not have done that. You were lying to me. She refused to believe he was ever an addict. It's really hard getting back into this. There was a break here. Somebody was at the door to do some work on the house, but it's just really hard to get back into this. I feel like I could keep giving details. I'm actually written a book about my own life with this, and there's probably a ton more details that I've already written in through those chapters that I'm not necessarily going to get into now. But I feel like the greater point that I'm trying to make is this. Women are absolutely as violent and as detrimental and abusive as a man can be. I can tell you from personal experiences how difficult it was for me to get over this, and how toxic and awful feminism, anti-maleism can be. And I think that people who rely and who exemplify such behavior, you're going to hear about similar stories in the future. You're going to hear mass stories. And, I really do believe now that if the current culture had existed in the 80s, I would have gotten my dick cut off and I would have been on hormone replacement therapy because, this idea that men are bad and that somebody would have applauded her for having done it and all of her feminist friends would have been on board. I guarantee you my mother would have mutilated me. Like, that would not have been a boundary that would not have been crossed to her. So the fact that this is happening now, the fact that this is so prevalent in modern culture, not only is it an issue to think about in terms of legislation and in terms of the way that the courts are set up, that women should absolutely get custody of children. I absolutely wish and pray and sit up nights thinking about how different my life would have been had my dad either gotten custody or asked for custody or believed the courts could have given him custody, or my grandparents. It was an open secret how crazy and abusive my mother was. I think that my grandmother felt guilt because I think she knew that she created a harder life for her daughter from her own actions that she was very ashamed of. I think most of my family that's hearing this will probably think that it's a lie because it just wasn't talked about. It wasn't addressed during that time or to my family. I mean, it was kind of one of those things that a lot of people I think wanted to take to the grave. But I think in doing so, you allow my mother to get away with what she did. And I also believe that this notion that, all I can tell you is that I wouldn't wish what was done to me to happen to anyone. And I hope that that can change someone's mind out there. I also hope that it's something that you are cognizant of when dating, because, my mom married multiple men, and multiple men thought that that was a good idea, that that was perfectly okay, and they never saw the crazy coming. And they should have.